All right. Hello. Today, guys, we're going to be starting Unit 3 of American History, your 11th grade year. This is the progressive era. Progressive kind of means we're trying to make things better. That's what this era is going to be all about. And our first lesson is titled The Populist Party. Our essential question, how did Western expansion and urbanization, the growth of cities, impact farmers' issues? Please make sure at this time to get out your journals and to write your heading at the top of your next page. Remember that journal checks are an important part of this class grade. All right, here we go. And remember, you can pause if you need to have extra time to write that down. All right, so we're going to start off talking about this thing called the Populist Party. They were a bunch of poor farmers who were having a bunch of problems in the late 1800s. There were four main reasons why these farmers were struggling. Number one, there was an overproduction happening. Overproduction is when you produce too much of something. And basically, these farmers, they were making too much of their crops, their soy, their corn, their wheat, whatever their crop was, they were making too much of it because they were dealing with falling prices. But the thing is, the more you make of something, the bigger the supply, the less the demand. It's going to cause prices to go down. So the harder they work, the actual less money they'd be making. So that is a problem called overproduction. And with these falling prices, many of these farmers, they didn't outright own their homes, or they took out loans for, new tractor equipment like the John Deere steel plows or some new mules, or, they took out many loans and they owed the banks a lot of money. And for this reason, banks, are going to call in their loans since farmers aren't making the prices that they want to with their crops. They will not be able to pay back those loans. So they're also being hurt by the banks. Their farms are being foreclosed on. That's when you have a loan on your home or on your farm, the place where you live. That's called a mortgage. That's a particular kind of loan. When you can't pay that back, the bank will foreclose. That means they will repossess. They will take back over your home and farm, and you'll lose it. So that was happening to a lot of farmers as well. That was problem number two. Problem number three had to deal with the big industries of this time period. Remember in our last unit, that was the Gilded Age. During the Gilded Age, you had these massive corporations, these big businessmen, robber barons, we called them, or if they were doing good things, captains of industry, guys like Carnegie, Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, and so on. Well, remember that they kind of controlled America at this time in the late 1800s, in the Gilded Age. This new progressive era we're talking about with the Populist Party, which right here, you're highlighting that. Remember, populism is this idea we talked about in Unit 1 that means power to the people, okay? They were not the ones in charge. It was the big businessmen that were in charge during this time. Business ruled America in the Gilded Age. So, one of the things that the farmers are going to struggle with are these big businesses. They're going to be taken advantage of, in particular, by the railroad industry. Because if you think about it, farmers, especially if they're making a cash crop, like they rely on, their income comes from selling one major crop. That's a cash crop. Let's say that it's wheat that you make bread out of. Well, in order to get your wheat to where it needs to be sold, you would need to transport large amounts of this big crop. And to do that, you would have to use a train. Trains knew that they were the only way to transport massive amounts of crops, so they're going to take advantage. They're going to exploit these farmers and their situation and charge super, super high rates. They're gouging them. That's what that's called. Because the railroads have a monopoly on transportation at this time. And there were, some robber barons that controlled most of the nation's railroads. There's no competition among the railroads because a monopoly is when there's no competition. So they could charge the farmers whatever they wanted. And you could see that you have corn production and prices. This is, 1870 to 1900. You could see that they're making more and more. That's the production levels. They're They're working really hard. Farmers are making more corn than ever. But here's 1870, 1900, those same years, looking at the prices, and you could see that it goes down and up, and then it goes way down. So they're making less. The more they work, the less they're making. That's overproduction. Banks are foreclosing because farmers, due to this drop in prices, are not able to pay back their mortgages. They lose the family farm. The banks foreclose on them. That's the second problem. Overproduction, banks, the railroads and other big corporations taking advantage of these poor Midwestern farmers. That's the third problem. And then the fourth and final problem, because I said there were four problems these poor farmers were facing, is that Mother Nature was not being very kind. In the 1870s in particular, there was a series of very hard, cold winters, big droughts each year. You don't got rain, you're not going to have crops, right? So those four problems are what farmers are dealing with, and they are really hurting. And there's no advocate for these farmers in our national government. Congress and the presidency were often controlled by the business interests. Like I said, in the Gilded Age, these robber barons kind of controlled the federal government. So there's no voice advocating on behalf of the farmers. Now, sharecroppers have it even kind of worse. At the end of the Civil War, remember that the 13th Amendment freed the slaves. 14th Amendment said that you're born here, you're a citizen, so it made these former slaves citizens of the United States. And the 15th Amendment gave African-American men of all colors, the right to vote. So you did have these newly freed people looking for something to do to, make a living. And unfortunately, many of them ended up still residing in the same places where they had been slaves, and their former slave masters continued to take advantage of them in a system called sharecropping. Sharecropping is where these former slaves, now freedmen, would rent a piece of that plantation farm. So they would rent it, they wouldn't own it, and they would have to work that land. And then at the end of the year, they'd have to give a portion or a share of their crop over to the landowner, like their former master. And they would also have to rent all the supplies they would need in order to farm that land, to give a share of their crop over to pay for their rent and everything else. So they were always indebted. So sharecroppers, these former slaves, these African Americans, primarily in the South, they have it especially bad. There were also a growing number of very poor whites as well who ended up as sharecroppers in the South during this time. This number is going to continue to grow into the all the way into the 1930s. This picture is of a poor prairie farmer family. Think of like a homestead family here in the middle of the country. Why do you think farmers were willing to put up with the hardships that came their way of living? Why would they live like you see these people in this picture? Well, it's because they had a chance to be in control of their own lives. They wouldn't have to be subservient to anybody else. That's why most of us want our own place. When we're kids, we want our own room. When we're adults, we want our own house. Some of us want to get way out in the country and be away from everybody. We want to have that autonomy. That means, to be in control of what we do instead of having somebody always telling us, like in school, right? That's why a lot of us don't like school. But that's that freedom. Because remember, we talked about this in Unit 1. Freedom, something that America's founded on, with like Alexis de Tocqueville's 5 values. Remember Liberté, that French dude? He talked about, liberty, individualism, laissez-faire. I talked about equality and populism. Well, liberty means freedom. That is something that, people think of when they think of America. There's the bell for school. That is something that they think about when we think about the United States. It's the land of freedom and opportunities, but freedom can mean many different things to different people. And for a lot of American history, freedom has meant the ability to own your own place, a place of your own. Here's another great chart showing you kind of what is happening. You can see all of these farm crops, such as wheat, that's in the blue, corn in the purple, oats in the orange, and barley, you make like bread out of, that is in the yellow. These are all kind of through from 1866 to 1896, the latter part of the 1800s. They're all doing what? They are going down, okay? And remember, it's because of those 4 reasons we were talking about: overproduction, banking troubles, problems with the big railroads and other monopolies, and Mother Nature, drought, okay? Those are the 4 problems why we're seeing this fall, why farmers are hurting. So what are they going to do about this? How are they going to try to get their voices heard so they can get some changes? They can get the railroads off their back, they can get the banks off their back. They can try to bring prices back up. What could they do? They're going to unite. Remember, this is very similar to what we talked about in the last unit with like those poor workers in factories. In order for them to get better working conditions, what did they do? They united. They formed like labor unions, okay? So here, farmers are going to do the same. The first united group of farmers to fight for their interest, they were known as the patrons of husbandry. Now, this is not talking about like being a husband. This is talking about animal husbandry or agricultural husbandry, when you work closely raising the land or raising animals, as farmers and ranchers do. Now, eventually, this would become the Grange movement. It's spelled right there. In your notes, you should write down this part that's in bold, okay? If not the whole thing, then at least the part that's in bold. But the Grange movement in the southern part of the United States and the western states, this is slowly going to morph into what we will call the Populist Party, which we'll talk more about in our part 2 of this first lesson. But the Grange movement, it's a political club, like a political party for these poor farmers dealing with these 4 problems that we've talked about. They're going to sue the railroad companies over their unfair gouging, their high prices to bring their crops to market in the cities. And because of the growing influence of these farmers in the Grange movement and eventually the Populist Party, the federal government, you'll start to see some congressmen elected by these farmers and by this political party. You start to see some influence. And because of that influence, we will get the first major law ever in American history, well, during this time period, that is going to regulate industry. That's a big deal. It's called the Interstate Commerce Act. Please, please, please make sure that you highlight it, highlight the stuffing out of it, whatever color you want, you know, purple, pink, neon, whatever, but make sure you highlight it. The Interstate Commerce Act, that is a huge, huge deal. It's the first time that the government is not going to be laissez-faire. Remember laissez-faire? Laissez-faire? It's that French term, like Sister Tocqueville talking about with our values. It's capitalism. It's the idea of the hands-off approach. The government ain't going to touch business. We're going to leave it alone, okay? But here is the opposite. This is government telling business, the railroad companies in particular, because they have big monopolies, government's telling those railroad companies, no, you cannot overcharge those farmers. So this is the opposite of laissez-faire. This is very different from the usual practice in the Gilded Age when, you know, government was all laissez-faire. And here's some wonderful political cartoons. I love these. This one right here, you see this train is like the big railroad monopolies exploiting, taking advantage of the farmers. There's exploitation and other words for how the farmers were being mistreated and abused and taken advantage of by the railroad company. And it's coming down. And then here you see like these are the farmers. They're about to be ran over by the railroad companies. The train's hurting them. In this political cartoon, you see these guys. These are like some of the farmers again. They are trying to corral and wrangle like cowboys would these wild bucking broncos, but instead of being like a donkey or a horse or a cow that they're trying to wrangle, it's these trains, showing that the railroad companies were out of control, taking advantage and hurting the farmers again. So that's what both of those political cartoons, the message in them, they're trying to relay. All right, the last thing for our notes today, you see this beautiful cartoon illustration right here. It asks in the question, how does the illustrator view the importance of American farmers? Well, we can see political leaders, military leaders, religious leaders, explorers, merchants, people selling things, schools and teachers, the railroad companies, the monopolists. But at the center of it all, 1776 when our country started to 1876, 1876 being, kind of this time period we're talking about, the Gilded Age and the early Progressive era. You see at the center is the farmers. And why? Because they feed us all, okay? That's how we know the importance of the farmers, that without them, none of these other groups or peoples would be able to function because we wouldn't have our food. Very important. Okay, so next time, Gadget, we will talk about the populist or the People's Party that will come up from these poor farmers and their troubles, from the patrons of animal husbandry and the Grange movement. We will get the People's Party, the populists. All right, I will talk to you guys later. Thank you so much. Bye.